A Christian Testimony. From New Age to Jesus Christ, a Modern Spiritual Odyssey. Part 3 of 9. In Part 3, the journey continues with a terrifying drug-induced state of consciousness, which leads to a search for answers and eventually a spiritual transformation. He goes through a period of disorientation, including experiencing the counterculture of the 1960s. He returns to a dramatically changed life in Philadelphia, where he subsequently delves into various spiritual practices, meditation, and the exploration of different religious and philosophical views including clairvoyance, and out-of-body experiences. Gone were the visions of elves and spirit beings. Gone were the joyous flood of colors and sounds. I had entered death and was not able to leave. I wanted to leave. Death and terror were not friends to me. Consciousness returned once again. My eyes opened to a different world. Wearing only blue jeans, without shoes or shirt, I managed to make it out of the park in search of help. I was terribly disabled by the drug. I could barely speak, and my appearance was as one lost and mindless. I recall approaching a lady who was carrying groceries. "Please help me," I tried to say. She screamed and fled. I walked further down the street and found a group of people sitting on the steps to their house. "Come on in, man. You're just having a bad trip." They sat me down in a chair between two large speakers and handed me a joint. Soon loud raucous music was blasting in my ears. Again, the terrors gripped me. Quickly I fled. Babbling like a mindless idiot, I sat in a heap in the middle of a downtown San Francisco sidewalk, weeping and unable to communicate. I remember so many people walking by, side glancing the oddity before them. Night was upon the city. I had to find shelter. I roamed through the city trying to find some safe haven. I came across a series of old condemned houses. The door was open to one of these. Upon entering, I found a strange person had already taken up permanent residence there. He motioned to me that there was a place to stay in one of the rooms. Each room was filled with debris, but the water and electricity still worked. The walls of the little enclave were filled with the sayings of Bob Dylan and various other prophets, philosophers and sages of the day. I lay on a used mattress contemplating the visions of darkness that continued to rush through my mind. Unable to sleep, I arose to look out the window only to see what I thought was a warning of impending doom. The buildings and streets were heaving under the undulations of a massive earthquake. In the middle of the night again I was driven to run. I managed to get a ride out of San Francisco to Berkeley across the bay. Along the way I picked up a copy of the San Francisco Oracle, an underground newspaper of the time. On its back page was a copy of Psalm 23 out of the Bible superimposed on a faded image of Jesus with a crown of thorns. I began to frantically repeat the psalm over and over. My arrival at Berkeley overwhelmed me. By a quirk of fate I found myself on Telegraph Avenue, the main thoroughfare to the University of California Berkeley campus, right in the middle of the first and most intense night of the famous Berkeley riots. Black Panthers, the Students for a Democratic Society, the Symbionese Liberation Army and the general populace of the area were menacingly looting and destroying everything in sight. Explosions, the crack of firearms, the condition of wanton abandonment to destruction shocked me all the more. In my drugged stupor I clutched the 23rd Psalm. Driven again by panic I began hitchhiking out of town. Like a dead leaf fallen from the autumn tree, I was set adrift by the raging winds of the times. My psyche was rendered vulnerable, and that vulnerability was taken full advantage of by elements I could not see. Forces far beyond the scope of my insight devoured my soul with the horrors of realms unseen. Now I was not only compelled to seek answers for a dying world, but now also for the whisper of life that remained in me to survive. I had become part of the death I was seeking to relieve. Somehow the drugs I had hoped would catapult me into spheres of spiritual power that in turn would give me insight into the horrible catastrophe that I saw humanity bound up in. These same drugs cast me into the bottom of the human race. I had mutated into the problem while seeking an answer to it. How could I find a way out? In 3 days I found myself in Portland, Oregon. Wandering about the city, I came upon a park that was the main gathering place for the hippies. Hungry and exposed to the elements, in a state of near incoherence, I managed to discover a Christian crash pad not far from the park. Crash pads were a common event in those days. No one really knew who paid the rent or where the food came from, but it was usually there. A Christian prototype was a curiosity to me. I had often eaten at the Hindu temple in the San Francisco Bay Area or perhaps at the Sufi food bank, but this was new. Bedraggled and somewhat shy, I entered what I found out later was the men's house. Though meals were taken together, sleeping quarters were separate for men and women. Upon entering, the atmosphere of the place and serenity of the occupants left a sure mark on me. Although it may sound strange, the definite glow of a spiritual light shone from the faces of most of the attendants. It so struck me that I was immediately desirous of shining in such a manner myself. I stayed. After several weeks I began to gain some semblance of living. I had acquired a job and vaguely grasped the message that my newfound friend said was the source of their joy and the peculiar light that emanated from their countenances. Just as a side note, I will mention that often I went to a mirror to study my face to discover if perhaps I also was beginning to shine. The man William Giersdorf was in charge of the activities about the house. He often studied the scriptures and taught in the evenings. He took me under wing and began instructing me also. Down to the Columbia River I went to be immersed in the waters. I had committed my life to Jesus and was beginning to gain ground. Not long after I began to stabilize, my concerns began to focus on the shattered pieces of life I left behind in Philadelphia. No one knew of my whereabouts. Surely it was right to return and make amends. The hitchhiking trip back was quick. My whirlwind tour of the counterculture took place in a year or so. It was clear upon my return that I wasn't alone in having my world turned upside down. Hardly anything remained of the life I once knew in Philadelphia. Old friends and acquaintances had also been swept up in the frenzied drug feed. I could hardly recognize many of them. While I was gone, my father had died. Was it an oddity of the era in which I lived that I saw neither of my parents buried? Family and friends had been scattered far and wide. My wife had thrown off any regard for our marriage and was now pregnant by a friend of hers. The pieces that were to be reassembled upon my return virtually didn't exist any longer. 1 year seemed an eternity. Time seemed so slow and change a snail's pace growing up as a youth. How different it was now. The life I sought to reconcile was non-existent. Again, I was starting from scratch in another turn of life. Fasting, praying and a cleansing diet became important to me in those days. My travels exposed me to the idea that I could improve the quality of my life by removing the effects of drugs and a lifetime of junk food. Also, there were many religious practices that associated eating with a higher plane of consciousness. I spent quite a bit of time studying methods of restoring my health with natural foods, naturopathic therapies, herbal remedies, and the diet systems in vogue in various parts of the world. Philadelphia at the time only boasted one health food store in the entire city of 13 million people. Under a flurry of circumstances, I met and began associating with a few fellows who were very interested in starting a natural food store. It all went very well. Soon we had a very large constituency enjoying our homemade soups and breads, carrot juice and whole grains. It took off like fire. One interesting aspect of the natural food industry is that it generally attracts people that have a broad range of spiritual perspectives. So it was that my daily life was exposed to a menagerie of philosophical and religious viewpoints. I took great care to hear out many of these views, especially those concerned with Jesus. I wonder how many of you reading this discourse remember a large cosmological book called Urantia? I read the entire thing. If you are unfamiliar with the publication, don't feel slighted. Another volume of particular interest caught my attention. It was titled The Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ. It contained an expose on the so-called hidden years of the life of the Messiah. A very elaborate and detailed description was given of the master's life that wasn't recorded in scripture, illustrating him going to the Far East, Egypt, and many of the world's mystery schools. It said that he attained to great mystical stature, then returned to the Holy Land for his public ministry. This idea became a catalyst to start me on the path of many spiritual disciplines and practices. These activities encompassed every aspect of my life, from eating, Zen macrobiotics, to astrology, tarot cards, the Chinese Book of Changes called the I Ching, and a very intense regime of meditation. Every publication and book that I could access quickly became fuel for my hungry mind. The Upanishads, Mahayana or Hinayana Buddhism, Khalil Gibran, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Tibetan Book of the Dead, and a host of others became components of my interest. I took a formal course in hypnotism and experimented considerably with it. Hatha Yoga, Mantra Yoga, and several of the other yogic practices were part of my self-styled regime. As my quest intensified, the spiritual aspect of life became very tangible. Clairaudience, clairvoyance, and the ability, without any use of drugs, to consciously interact with the spiritual realm soon became a common practice for me. Visions and the profound experience of leaving my body made my effort seem rewarding and exciting. I was attaining mastery. In one session of meditation, I hovered over my body and was able to observe my physical form and all the objects in the room. This is the end of part 3 of 9. Please like, share, or subscribe to our channel. Thank you and may God bless you. Thank you for listening to this testimony. We hope it has been helpful. Now, let's briefly introduce a new book, The Surface Theory by R.G. Gibson, that presents two new innovative creation theories. Born from personal revelation and years of research, these two theories emerged from previously overlooked key words, offering profound new insights into Genesis. This book also unveils new scientific discoveries related to this topic. Prepare for a paradigm shift that makes Genesis logical, dissolving the previous barriers between faith and science. Find the key to these mysteries and many more within the pages of The Surface Theory by R.G. Gibson, available on Amazon.